talking alternative proteins. We're doing that with Professor Hugh Campbell from Otago University. G'day, Hugh. Nice to talk to you again.
Nice to be back in, yes.
What was our last chat? I can't even remember now. We've had a few of them now.
It was National Lamb Day.
Was too.
Yes, we were doing a little history nerd out to the importance of 1882 Port Chalmers and the SS Dunedin.
Yes, and actually you put it up there with 1973 as the most significant dates in terms of agriculture history
in New Zealand history.
Yes, exactly. Do you know I answered a question correctly at a beef and lamb function just after, about a week or two after that day, won a bottle of wine too, and it was, can you name the captain on the SS Dunedin?
A bottle of wine that I wouldn't have won. I can't remember his name. What was it? Something Philpott or Gilchrist or what was he?
John Whitson was the guy's name.
Yes. He crawled into the hole.
That's the one.
To knock the air holes through and save the ship.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
True hero of New Zealand's farming industry.
Very much so. So that won me a bottle of wine, which I never saw, of course, because the rest of the family nabbed it. But hey, what are you going to do? Alternative proteins, Mr. Campbell. Why are we talking about this? You have hosted a webinar recently about this.
Yeah, we just finished a project funded by our Land and Water National Science Challenge, and this is we're in the reflective stage of what did we find out, and so we had a webinar, very interesting. More than 250 people online, some pretty senior R&D managers from around primary production in New Zealand. So clearly a topic that for some people is quite interesting, needs following, needs watching. Whereas for most other people, you're sort of hearing about the alternative proteins thing and go, what the hell is that?
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at it. I've been looking at this over the past, say, 12 to 18 months, or longer, but obviously it came out with a hiss and a roar, effectively. In the last year or so, there have been a number of indicators that the industry itself, the bubble burst. Fair?
The bubble, the balloon deflated.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Not completely popped,
no, definitely not.
But it lost some air.
No, and that's really a sign of when this all began to happen. So, 2013, Sergey Brin did the Impossible Burger demonstration, right. And it just fell at a time when a whole lot of hot venture capital was looking for sexy new stuff. The fact that it was a new food stuff. With huge kind of added benefits around climate change and environmental profile, really got a lot of interest. So massive surge of venture capital going into it, and the explosion of startups was absolutely incredible. And then under the pandemic conditions, when suddenly all the capital dried up, there were a lot of casualties. So we were really arriving into this at a time of Is it completely wrecked, or are people beginning to crawl out of the wreckage? And what we're seeing is that there are a couple of developments coming out of this that are looking like they've got legs.
Oh, okay.
Looking like something will happen.
Right, because recently, what was the New Zealand one? Was it Sunfed?
Sunfed,
yes.
Sunfed. And those are directly plant-based.
Yes.
So that was really using plants, using things like peas to get pea protein, and then using good food technology and food science to make it look and taste as much as you can like a meat product, or in the case of oats, using oats to make oat as oat milk.
Yes.
And some of those, I think that the oat milk market is very strong.
It really is, and I've spoken to a couple of producers, and the amount of cafes, as an example, that they supply is off the charts.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we discussed at the webinar is that there is a little sentiment out there amongst some consumers out there who are looking for ways to kind of avoid classic dairy products. They're a little aggrieved with the dairy industry for various reasons, this gives you a sort of a nice, comfortable consumer outlet to do that. The meat ones are struggling more, the ones that are meat analogues, which are just coming out of plants. But I'm not counting them out. Those ones, you don't want to count those out. But
who's emerging out of the wreckage then that you alluded to just before?
Yeah, so that's the kind of sexy science end of things, the stuff that got all the big venture capital into it. So two things. There's the two that still seem to be moving forward. One is still a little challenged. Put it like, I'll start it a slightly different way. there are two science processes now. There are two science tech engineering processes now that we know work.
Okay.
So, and the science is very sophisticated and interesting, and has got a lot of people excited for what it now unlocks. The one that still faces a few barriers is sort of growing meat cells in vitro, so lab-grown meat.
Okay.
And there, you extract cells out of an animal, out of muscle tissue, and then you stick it inside some kind of container, and then you feed it serum. And most of the sexy science is in the serum. It's like, how do you make that meat cell think that it's still inside an animal?
Muscle, yeah.
And then you create scaffolding, like mini scaffolding, and so you see these kind of long tendrils of meat being grown that then get recomposed into a burger.
Okay.
The science is really interesting, but it's still really slow to grow.
Yeah, right.
So that stuff is expensive. That's a sort of a watch this space one, because it may yet take off. Because really what you get out the other end in the meat patty is meat. It's just meat, but there was no animal attached to it.
There was no animal. So actually, technically, it's not like a plant derivative. It's
No,
actually a meat derivative.
It's the thing.
That's a very different thing.
It's a very different thing. Yeah. And the one that New Zealand has to keep a really close eye on, and I think, feedback from our webinar is there are some very big players keeping a very close eye on this. Is what we call precision fermentation.
Right.
So basic process, take DNA out of a cow. Use good genetic science to identify what's the DNA sequence that expresses a particular protein, that takes basic sugars or energy, various things in the bloodstream of the cow, and converts it into a dairy protein that then gets excreted with the milk.
Right.
And so you find that DNA sequence, you identify a particular kind of yeast. Living yeast, you take the DNA, put it into the yeast in such a way that the yeast begins expressing the dairy protein.
Oh, wow.
And then all you do is get a lot of this yeast, stick it inside a big stainless steel vat, and feed it water and sugar, and it'll produce dairy protein for you.
Okay.
So that is the big one, because the science has been done, and they're proving they can do it at scale.
I was just going to ask you about that. As opposed to the lab-grown meat example that you just gave, is certainly nowhere near scale yet.
It could be in 10 years' time, but not. Whereas the precision fermentation of dairy proteins is a thing.
Right.
And that is why I think you're seeing Fonterra's already taken a share in a couple of these startup companies,
which is
doing
smart.
exactly a very smart thing to do, because because we're in the world of, then you're in the world of interesting consequences.
Yes.
So the barrier to precision fermentation becoming a big deal is how many stainless steel vats can you find?
Sure.
Ironically, the company or the industry that is the most experienced at developing stainless steel vat technology is the dairy industry.
Yeah, right. Of course.
But a stainless steel vat full of yeast excreting dairy proteins is still an expensive thing compared to a pile of dairy cows.
Sure.
So you've got very big capital startup costs.
But over time, won't it be much more cost efficient?
Much more cost efficient ever. Well, this is the reason why you're seeing the big investors into this area are like food insecure, wealthy countries like Arab Gulf states, Israel.
Yeah.
And so over time, if you've got the venture capital to sink into it, you can set these things up, and they are setting up very big facilities in various deserts around the place. From that point on, you need a little bit of science to keep yourself going with your yeast line.
Yeah.
You need water and sugar.
Okay.
Which are incredibly easy to attain, particularly if you're getting your sugar from plants. Well, all sugar comes from plants that we use.
Yeah.
So what that means is that you model a massive shift in terms of the way in which dairy protein is produced towards land-based production that is basically sugar-producing plants.
It's insane.
And it's not going to be hard to do. So this is why we started this project, which was
clearly
why this is, to my eye, for history nerds like us, this has the potential to be one of those big bang technologies that has kind of just what we might call highly destructive potential for the industries that it's substituting. So,
Wow. And the fact that dairy companies, it's kind of like tobacco companies taking an interest, taking shares in vaping products. You know
Oh,
what I
yeah.
mean? It's like you see the winds of change coming, and you
I'm
go.
not sure that's an analogy that Fonterra would buy into, but it's sort of
they
see
can-
where you're going.
They can lump it, mate. Actually, the analogy is to my mind, holds up. It's you've got an industry that
You're being substituted.
Exactly, and so
Yeah.
what do? Well, you jump on board the substitution.
You have to.
Exactly.
Now, this is where our project started, and I've always been interested in one of our other project partners over from Norway, but been interested in the kind of the big historical substitutions that happened in agriculture. Things go back 200 years, and it's when chemical science worked out how to create food flavorings that could substitute for vanilla pods. Vanilla pods grown in tricky little plantations in Madagascar getting substituted by a chemical alternative, an artificial flavouring. When chemical dyes came in and wiped out entire land-based sectors that used to produce indigo and things like that.
Right.
And so you look at those, and the one that's most the one that's most uneasy for us to think about is our wool industry, because through the 20th century, I mean, while the top line history of the wool industry is economic and it's political, it's about how do you run that industry? Do we need a wool board? How do you deal with the stockpile? How is this integrating with various world wars and empires? Underneath that is this death struggle with artificial fibres, which are coming in the around World War I in the 1920s through rayons, which were based out of wood cellulose. And then after World War II with the petrochemical industry and science explosion with the polyesters.
Yes.
And there's no doubt that for the wool industry in New Zealand, artificial fibres were a devastating substitute.
Wrecked it.
And the only way in which you either you find your way forward by getting into a small niche high value add thing like fine wool, or you blend.
Yeah.
You basically blend with the enemy.
Yeah.
And that's where we've ended up. The 20th century history of the wool industry has been a massive technological substitution. So you look at precision fermentation of dairy proteins and think, are we in for the same thing? That's where our project started. And so, we began modelling outcomes, Don. We began modelling outcomes of what might happen.
And now this is the interesting part, because I had a bit of a read last week. You sent me through basically a bit of a summation, I guess, of some of the things you've been looking into. As far as I could understand, that you've kind of mapped out 3 scenarios.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably worth going through those. I think that's where you're heading, effectively.
We'll start with baseline, which is 3 scenarios against baseline. So baseline is not too scary for New Zealand. Baseline is basically that everything happens as it's happening at the moment, and the trajectories going forward happen at the current speed they're kind of happening. And this is the one that we've got a lot of discussion at the webinar. Is baseline going to hold? And we used various things because various big consulting firms are all over this because they're trying to work out investment trajectories. Boston Consulting Group did a really big analysis on, and they came down with what is the growth rate in the world protein market going to be for the next 50 years? How much protein are we actually going to need? Animal protein are we going to need? And so the baseline that they provide is protein demand is going to keep going up. The more of the world is going to want more animal protein, and as a result, artificial animal proteins are going to come in, but the rising demand the rising tide is going to lift all boats, and so New Zealand will always still have a niche for our natural animal derived animal proteins.
Yes.
And I think that's quite a comforting scenario, provided all those things hold. So we tried 3 scenarios, toggling what might happen. One in which precision fermentation took off, one in which standard normal plant-based substitutes for meats took off, and the third was when everything, including in vitro meat, lab-based meat, takes off. And those are not... Well, those are challenging scenarios to think through for New Zealand.
Yeah, very much so, because that's overhauling everything we've done for 100+ years.
Yeah, Not quite. I mean,
You don't think so?
in any of those scenarios, and so we used a group of modelers at Lincoln University who are very good at doing this, and they did some modelling of where this goes economically and the trade-offs between land use and the trade-off between growing plants and continuing to raise animals. And the sort of the scenarios go, all three scenarios kind of end up in a similar place.
Okay.
Not entirely the similar place, but all of them see some substitution of land use from animals into plants. It just goes without saying.
Yeah.
And so there is, in all these scenarios, there's some shrinkage of the footprint of livestock farming on New Zealand's landscape. Not a huge shrinkage, but there is. And so there are negative consequences for traditional livestock production sectors, particularly in the precision fermentation scenario.
I can imagine.
It's dairy.
It's dairy cows. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's pretty obviously in the food ingredients sector,
100%.
because that's what these precision fermented proteins do so well. But so that's the downside. So, heartfelt concern for a whole lot of traditional livestock sectors. They should be watching this very closely. But the modelling also showed that actually there's a potential for quite a lot of economic growth in New Zealand as other things begin to happen. You end up with a much bigger arable farming sector, and arable's actually a pretty high value producing sector. And you end up with a lot more science R&D. You end up with the potential to be producing things in New Zealand we wouldn't otherwise do. So in terms of economically, New Zealand ended up slightly better off in the other scenarios.
Wow.
And partly this is because we produce so much traditional dairy that any reduction in traditional dairy any reduction in that has an impact on the world market price. The price goes up.
Fair enough.
So there is an impact there, but we actually do grow some other quite high value things. And
Sorry, I just want to interject, because the question then to me becomes, okay, so precision fermentation, who is getting rich off this though? So yes, the nation as a whole does well.
That's a good question, and I'll just hold that question.
Okay.
But there's
Carry
one
on.
more thing to say.
Yes.
The alternative scenarios where we do more precision fermentation and the like, and New Zealand moves to more plant-based landscape, has a massively positive impact on our greenhouse gas and our environmental profile.
Right.
And that's
So
one
you
of the
can
things
see
we
where
model.
this is going.
That's why people are so keen to get into this.
Yeah. Okay.
Cheap, extremely predictable food production in which there's far less methane being produced from animals, and there's far less fertilizer, there's far less nitrogen being used, and phosphates. So, in terms of some of our key long-term environmental problems, everyone's kind of antennae goes up. In fact, on the scenario 3, which is this alternative stuff takes off across the board, the reduction that we experience in traditional livestock production more than accounts for the entire reduction of greenhouse gas budget for New Zealand.
Wow. Say that again.
It's phenomenal.
Run through.
So if this really takes off, we do end up with a residual livestock farming sector, but we have met our entire greenhouse gas requirements.
Okay.
In terms of the current targets we're setting. So there's huge stakes.
And
so
this
you can
is
see
big. This is huge, isn't it?
If it happens, and I think that's why more than 250 agribusinesses kind of tuned in to the webinar.
No
going,
kidding.
How's that modelling looking? Because we're not the first to model. It's just every year the modelling gets a little more precise. There's a little more on the board, and some of the predictions, 3 years ago before the bubble burst on a lot of kind of wacky, very very idealistic stuff that was coming out. Now we're modelling on stuff that crawled through the hard moment and is coming out the other side.
Yeah, right. So they've gone through all the checks and balances. They've gone through the grindstone. They've, been battered and bruised, but they've actually come out and they've survived the knocks. So,
and now they're sitting on massive venture capital being put in from Arab Gulf states and Israel.
Yeah, which you always want that money, don't you? When you're getting into anything, you want the Arab Gulf money.
Can I look back to your previous question, which is the right one?
Yeah.
Because I think you can see the potential for, and by the way, these were all this modelling was out to 2035 and to 2050, and for those who are sitting there now going, we're completely screwed, not much actually happens on these scenarios out to 2035. It's the 2050 modelling that's quite dramatic.
Okay.
And you ask yourself, so who's going to be running our landscape by then? And I think that is the question that a lot of people ask about this, which is, unlike a previous revolution around genetics, around GMOs, where some of the big companies that initially put the big bucks in, like Monsanto, were not the most beloved companies in the world,
No.
this thing has been driven by winsome and charismatic venture capitalists, who have big social media profile. And I don't think Elon Musk's put any money into this yet, but if it starts to go, he will.
Has Gates put money in? I bet he has.
I suspect he has, yeah. That's their kind of thing, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, so you start off with very friendly faces, but if it scales up, it's very likely to be very large, established agribusiness players.
Exactly, that's what I'm
who
saying. It's
plunge
going to
into
be
it.
the inevitable corporatisation of the food production system that I think we're facing.
There are certainly people who think this is where this takes us.
It's clearly, mark my words, people, this is where it's going.
And I think for food, for sort of your more sort of progressive left activists in this area, people who look with suspicion at anything new that comes in into land use, this one is really complex to think through because the environmental and climate change gains are so big.
Yes.
But the cost comes that your food sector gets corporatised.
See, the very progressive activist left side, I think, will stop at the environmental impact being greatly reduced. And I think that for them will be the clincher.
Yeah.
Then they're going to find that then you're just living in a world of like big food, and there's going to be a handful of corporations.
Nestle.
Yep, that own
Kraft.
frickin' everything, right? And
Even more than they currently do, Don.
yeah, because what was the quote I heard the other day? Something about if you control food, you control people. If you control something, you control nations, and if you can control food, you can control people. I can't remember what the first one was in relation to nations, but anyway, and I sort of saw that and thought, yeah, that's where we're going. That's totally where we're going.
Yeah, and if you think what New Zealand Inc. Strategy is from here, obviously in terms of what we were modelling, the more investment you can put into R&D and science, the more you get things to stick in New Zealand.
Yeah.
The more chance you have to divert some of this into much more high value stuff. I mean, you can see that, Food Corp Global, as you're pointing out, is going to grab a massive share of processed food ingredients and processed food markets.
Exactly.
Probably not exactly where New Zealand wants to be in 2050 anyway.
No.
So the pressure is on us to have very well-based R&D, and a lot of incentives in place to keep some of the, to have it stick in New Zealand. And the other side, of course, is that for traditional animal land use, go up the market. We just got to keep pushing up the market. We've got to keep doing a better value-add proposition. We've got to keeping a good environmental. I mean, you can see how this puts the pressure on in terms of environmental performance.
This is the thing, because I was sort of thinking, okay, so I've been talking to people lately and I've heard it talked about with the advent of AI, what's going to happen, I think, is potentially that people are going to look at, let's just take arts, for example, let's take music or writing or something like that, right? So AI can spit these things out in no time at all, right? But I think it's the when you've got the human touch, that's going to be where the real value is, where the real high-end stuff comes in. You go and see something that's clearly made by human beings. I think that's going to have real currency in the artistic world, right? Then I look at it in terms of the commodity world, and I think to myself, well, could there be a case where, sure, there's mass production of process, fermentation, as an example, and all these other sorts of lab-grown meat once they get that to scale, which they inevitably will. Is there going to still be a place for this can actually come off a sheep or a cow or something like that?
Absolutely, I'm sure there is. as academics, we face exactly the same issue with ChatGPT and the other generative.
You can fully tell at the moment, ChatGPT,
You
though.
can.
I can tell an AI-generated text.
Mm-hmm.
It's so obvious right now.
It's very dull.
It's so dull. It's got zero personality to it. It's so robotic.
So we're not worried yet. We're not worried
Not
that
yet.
they're going to write novels that are going to put us out of business.
God, that'd be boring. Yeah.
Yeah, they would be boring. Yeah, and so for foodstuffs, look, it's the same mission for New Zealand we've been on for decades now, which is you have to push up the market, and you have to push up the market with absolutely unimpeachable qualities, including environmental qualities, which is why it's a little tragic at the moment that we're stuck. We're stuck at the moment in terms of our livestock sector moving on this.
Yeah.
Well, no, there's probably a different interview, Dom. Well, we might save that for another day.
Okay, all right. Oh, I like the sound of that. The other point that I would make around that sort of stuff is I think the problem so far with your alternative proteins, as an example, and there's been a few really key videos that have gone around in the last few years that have had farmers and stuff sort of showing the process around, okay, you think by not eating meat and by eating a meat alternative that you're being environmentally aware and conscious and you are helping in some way. Then you see the process of how that's made, and that I think has had a big resonance as to why this stuff has largely failed to take off to the extent that they were predicting, let's say, a decade ago. Those videos have been very powerful, and people have gone, oh geez, actually a bit of grass-fed steak is much more environmentally friendly on every metric pretty much, as opposed to some of these horrendously produced products from other means.
So I would say the clearest analogue would be margarine.
Yeah.
So margarine is the product which has become absolutely ubiquitous as a cheap spread.
Yes.
But if you saw a video of how margarine was made, it's not hugely attractive.
It's gross. Yeah.
It's just an industrial product. It's a cheap, well-made, very clean and predictable industrial product, and the reason why we don't all eat margarine, the reason why we still have butter on our crumpets or our toast, and why we still have, some still have real whipped cream on their scones, others the spray can version, is because there is a different proposition to an actual production system, and I think, between now and 2050, we have to make that journey. We just have to. Or else things will not look the same outside the cities to what I grew up with.
Incredible. Wow. So much to take in there. That's fantastic. Appreciate you coming in and giving us that overview. What's next for the project that Our Land and Water Science Challenge?
You're supposed to finish on an upbeat thing, aren't you?
Well,
because the National Science and Challenges have all been shut down by the current government.
Oh, really?
So the funding ends in the middle of the year for ours and a whole pile of other actually really interesting projects. So,
because I've covered a load of these projects on the program, and they're
all shutting down.
Oh, sheesh, because they've been fantastic. Some of the work that's come out of them have just been unbelievable. Who do we need to talk to about this, Hugh?
Yes.
Todd McClay. Should I put should we give him a call? Who's cutting the funding for this?
Yeah, I think it's gone in the general search for money to pay for tax cuts. Yeah.
There's certain things you cannot dispense with.
If you want these things to stick in New Zealand, you have to keep the R&D going. You have to keep the research going. And the National Science Challenges were, I think, they weren't perfect, but they were a pretty damn good experiment at targeting good research towards key issues in land use.
And the thing about these is that they only just start to ask questions, and they need years more work to go on top of the initial stuff that's been done. I mean, this is the scientific process.
They do, and it's not just the National Science Challenges. I think there's a lot of concern out on the Crown Research Institute.
Yeah.
And again, no research organisations by their very definition are highly inefficient. You do a whole lot of thinking and a whole lot of research and come out with a very small number of potentially highly important outcomes. And so they're always vulnerable to efficiency drives. There'll always be people who come in new to the scene and go, oh yes, if we can just make them 10-20% more efficient, you don't need those extra scientists over there. You end up undermining the whole basis of which R&D happens,
Yes.
particularly around farming. Well, in any area, but for New Zealand, particularly around farming.
Yeah, this is to be ignored at our absolute peril.
Yeah, I think that I'm not expecting there to be much funding in my space for the rest of my career. We're just not, we're not a priority that this government would see the kind of the sustainability and the social dynamics of farming stuff that has been what I've done over the years. But there's cuts going into really fundamental science, and I think some of the cuts that happened up at Massey are quite alarming. Some of the cuts into plant science and the like are really sending a terrible signal about where we'll be in 5 to 10 years' time.
Oh, yeah, that's terrible. Hate to hear that, but the evidence is.
You can go back. Look, if you think that's too downbeat, Dom, you go back about 5 minutes and finish the podcast earlier.
No, we'll finish on a good call. But there is a dose of reality to be had here as well, and you've provided that. So. Appreciate that. What do you? Let's finish on an upbeat topic or topics. Let's change tack. What are you reading at the moment? What's good? I need your recommendations for the people, Hugh.
Well, it's probably more what we're streaming at the moment.
Yes, no, this is read, watch, listen. So there's all three. So what's you must have read. You're a professor for God's sake.
It's a bad time of year for me, as you would know. It's coming to the end of the English Premier League, and so it's all eyes on every result.
Okay, so your read, watch, listen is basically EPL football. That's what you've been reading, watching, and listening.
I'm ashamed to say it.
No, that's not.
Football is life.
Well, football. You know what is very, very close to life. I would have to agree with you. And okay, so who's your team again?
Liverpool. Yeah.
You're a Liverpool man.
We're still in it, but by the skin of our teeth.
Yeah. I've dropped the ball quite literally on the EPL this season. I don't know why. I'm not sure why. There's no reason for that. It's just it's
been a barn burner of a season.
Yeah,
Dom.
I know. I've missed out.
You looked away.
Yeah, I did. I looked away. Too much other sport. Watched a lot of tennis. I don't know. Not sure. Work's too busy. Long may that continue.
Yeah.
Speaking of Sunset Industries.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
But on the book list, we're going away on holiday, and the book that I've got a few books I'm taking away.
Yep.
I think it's there's a few there, but I'll report back to you next time how they went.
Well, I'm reading one at the moment. It's taking me an age because it's a doorstopper. It's a tome. It is History of the World as told by families.
Oh, okay.
Simon Sebag Montefiore. Have you heard of the
Montefiore?
The British historian. He's written this thing. It's huge.
Yeah.
And I'm getting through that at the moment. I'm up to. I've just finished the Great Reign of the Khans. The Mongols.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
I've got Hilary Mantel's third part of the Cromwell series.
Oh, right.
Mirror and the Light.
Yeah,
I've been saving it for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
Because I know it's going to be good.
Yeah. Interesting. Good stuff. Hugh Campbell, as always, lovely to have you in the studio.
Yeah, great to be here, Dom.